Let's move to France now, Vanessa, and will the protests continue?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is extraordinary footage of the French protesters. This is predominantly against the new the hike in the retirement age. Sorry, and here you have the protesters actually storming the Paris Stock Exchange, Euronext. And of course, a couple of weeks ago, I think they stormed BlackRock. So it does appear that these French protesters against general austerity laws being brought in under Macron's very much globalist influence government are pretty savvy about the heart of the beast that they're attacking. Let's have a look at the video. I mean, really extraordinary scenes. I mean, Macron, I don't know, he must be, I think now in the record books as the most hated French president in history, actually. But this is also taken from a translation of an article in Le Monde, which appeared, first of all, in the Official Journal, official journal, decree authorizing the use of drones by the police in France in certain cases, published in official journal. Authorizes the use of drones by police, gendarmes, customs, or military in some cases for prevention of damage to the safety of people, etc. So this is basically the text of a law that was passed about a year ago, and interesting that it's now suddenly been brought into effect with the increase of the protests pretty much across all of France against Macron's austerity laws and changes in legislation. So it authorizes the use of drones by police, gendarmes, customs, or military for prevention of attacks on the safety of people and goods in places particularly exposed, for assembly security on public roads, as well as support agents on the ground to enable them to maintain or restore public order, prevention of acts of terrorism, regulation of transport flows, border surveillance in order to combat their irregular crossing, and help for people. Are there other situations where law enforcement officials can use these small remote-controlled aircraft? That sounds very much like military law to me.
Well, quite possibly. Now, I wanted to get your thoughts on the story of the French publisher arrested on earlier in the week, on Monday. This is Ernest Morel. If you remember, we covered this on Wednesday's program. He, if you remember, was approached by two plainclothes police at St. Pancras station on Monday evening after arriving by train from Paris. He was arrested following 6 hours of questioning for alleged obstruction and refusing to disclose passcodes to his phone and computer. His phone and computer were seized by police. They remain in police custody. And then he was released on bail. He will have to return to London in May. Now, we showed a little bit of the response from the publisher itself on Wednesday's program. Here's a little bit more for you. Perhaps more seriously, they said during his interrogation, he was asked to name the anti-government authors in the catalogue of the publishing house La Fabrique, for which he works. None of these questions should be relevant to a British police officer. And so the questions continue as to why this happened in Britain. Now, if you remember, if we focus, I just want to focus a little bit more on this whole business of being asked to disclose passcodes and passkeys for phones and for laptops and so on. This comes from Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act. 2000, a national security port and border power, the government says. Of course, this removes your right to silence and the right to not incriminate yourself because you're required to give up your encryption keys. And I was wondering, Vanessa, whether this was a case of the French government asking the British to intervene here because we have that legislation in place. What's the situation in France? Well, it turns out that in November last year, the courts decided that, in fact, refusing to disclose your phone password would now be a criminal act. So this article saying the refusal to communicate the unlocking code of a mobile phone can constitute an offence. Judges in the Court of Cassation, the action was called upon to rule on a drug trafficking case in which a court of appeal had acquitted a suspect who refused to give the unlock code for his two telephones, despite the case law of the Court of Cassation. So anyway, that was effectively made illegal. But there is another piece of legislation, and that is the Article 30 of the law 2001-1062 on community safety. This allows a judge or a prosecutor to compel a qualified person to decrypt or surrender keys to make available any information encountered in the course of an investigation. So that seems like a much harder process in France. You've got to go to court. You've got to get a court order from a judge before you can compel someone. Whereas in the UK, the terrorism police can just lift you and compel you on the spot. And if you don't, then you're taken to court and face fines. Now in France, the failure to comply is 3 years jail time and a fine of 45,000 euros. But if it turns out at the end of the day that compliance would have guaranteed or would have prevented a crime, then the penalty is 5 years in prison and a 75,000 euro fine. So in both countries, we have this similar legislation, but in the UK, it seems easier to sort of cause problems for people or to compel the requirement to give up a passcode. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on the arrest of this guy. And because the reason I'm interested is because this happened to you not so long ago.
Yeah, I was just going to say. And I mean, what's extraordinary, yes, I recognize the 6 hours detention because that's the maximum they can hold you for questioning, right? When I came off the plane and they stopped me, I said to them I wasn't going to give them my mobile phone. I wasn't going to hand anything over to them. And they then told me, yes, well, if I didn't give them the passwords, I was liable to prosecution. And they can forcibly take the phone from me anyway. So it's better to comply with them. But I mean, it's quite extraordinarily intrusive that someone who simply took part in legitimate protests or has written about, from an opposition perspective to the French government can be picked up on British soil in this way. I mean, it's quite extraordinary the lengths to which they're going to now and how brazen it is, this campaign to prevent dissent from almost any quarter. It's extraordinary. And I think, yes, probably he was picked up in the UK, although I don't know if there has to be some kind of treaty between the UK and France for them to be able to do that. It seems strange because UK is no longer part of the EU. So under what laws does that fall, unless, of course, they're simply picking him up under the anti-terrorism pretext?
That's exactly what it was. It was under the anti-terrorism pretext.
But the European arrest warrant is still recognized, even though
it is. But that wasn't invoked in this case. But my point is that all it would have taken.
Who, Mike? Because it has to be surely terrorism against the UK. It can't be terrorism against France. I mean, what was the threat to the UK?
That is a very good point. Yes, that is a very good point. So where does that take us?
Well, it takes us to a journalist being detained for attending a protest in Britain, a French journalist attending a French protest being arrested under anti-terror laws in Britain. And his publishers come out with the statements. I think the NUJ, National Union of Journalists in the UK, has also said they're very concerned about this. And let's just kind of put this in context while this is happening. We have this situation which is still unresolved. 4 years held in a Category A maximum security prison, HM Belmarsh in southeast London, Julian Assange. And he is unconvicted. It's been 4 years this month. So awaiting supposedly extradition to the United States. So I just think that's worth reminding people that this is a grave injustice to an award-winning journalist, an award-winning publication, WikiLeaks, that somehow became an enemy of the state, and he's being stitched up at the moment. But guess what? There's a lot of legal eagles that are lining up and desperate to get a hold of this case. It's never been challenged. The Espionage Act has never properly been challenged in relation to journalism before. And all the experts, Mike, including Bruce Afrin here, said this is almost a slam dunk for Julian Assange. Now, that's not going to be easy in a national security court in Virginia here, but he's pointing out the obvious. Assange is being prosecuted, at least in part, as retaliation for speech. And that is a protected right in America under the First Amendment. The government charges that WikiLeaks publishes U.S., quote, rules of engagement in Iraq, but WikiLeaks says it released these only after the U.S. defended the collateral murder video by claiming that the killings were within the laws of war and the rules of engagement. So it's very clear, as a journalistic outlet, they did what they felt was in the public interest. Mm-hmm. And I don't think anybody's going to argue that wasn't in the public interest. Government hasn't proved its case that this put anyone at danger. So, and they finish off here. So all this was of intense public interest and well within the bounds of journalism, and to use the undefined contours of the Espionage Act, which is almost over 100 years old, piece of legislation, essentially, to prosecute Julian Assange in this way certainly smacks of retaliation for protected First Amendment activity. That's the main point. And I think this is what a lot of people are realizing. This might be why you could see his case potentially take an interesting turn in the near future to save off the political embarrassment of trying to basically enforce the Espionage Act against the First Amendment and journalism here. And also in Australia, there's a lot of pressure right now on the Albanese government, Mike, to make a move on this. Now, Penny Wong, their foreign minister, has made some very unsavory comments about this here. But activists here, the campaign to free Julian Assange has urged Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to boost its efforts to negotiate the WikiLeaks founder's release when the government meets the U.S. and the U.K. next month to discuss the AUKUS deal. Now, I'm going to say, Mike, fat chance that that's going to happen at the AUKUS deal. But what's interesting is the activists are very focused. You can see they're lining themselves up with the meetings of governments, and the geopolitical scope is also included in this. To me, this is interesting because now journalists have to report this and they have to put things in context. Something that mainstream journalists hate doing is putting things in context. So I'm very encouraged by the Australian activists on this. It looks like they're stepping their game up a little bit for Julian Assange.